The nurse gave a silent signal to a SEAL commander at the airport. What happened next locked down the terminal. "Don't look at him," the man in the tailored gray suit whispered, his fingers biting into the soft flesh of Brianna's upper arm, hidden completely beneath the oversized fabric of her navy blue medical scrubs. "Smile at the gate agent. Hand over the boarding passes." Brianna's pulse hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She forced the corners of her mouth upward, her fingers trembling just enough to rattle the paper passes as she slid them across the sleek synthetic granite of the airline counter. To the rest of the bustling morning crowd in Terminal 4, she was merely an exhausted travel nurse accompanying an elderly, wealthy patient. But the tall, broad-shouldered man, standing in the periphery, near the coffee kiosk, the one with the faded canvas duffel bag and eyes like chips of flint, wasn't just anyone. She caught his gaze. Deliberately, fighting the tremor in her hands, she folded her thumb into her palm, wrapping her forefingers tightly over it. "Help me." Brody went perfectly still. The noise of the terminal evaporated. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was a cathedral of transient chaos at 7 in the morning. A symphony of rolling luggage wheels, garbled overhead announcements, and the low, collective murmur of thousands of people rushing toward distinct destinies. Commander Brody stood perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet near a crowded coffee kiosk, letting the chaotic energy of the terminal wash over him. He had been back stateside for less than 48 hours. The phantom grit of a Syrian desert still felt baked into the creases of his knuckles, and the sudden immersion into a brightly lit, commercialized American reality always left an unsettling ringing in his ears. He wore faded denim, a dark, unmarked Henley, and a scuffed leather jacket. He looked like a man who worked with his hands, perhaps construction or logging a deliberate camouflage. Only another professional would notice the way his eyes constantly scanned the exits, or the way his back never fully faced an open room. He took a slow sip of black coffee, letting the bitter heat ground him. He was tired. A bone-deep, soul-scraping kind of exhaustion that sleep could no longer cure. All he wanted was to board his connecting flight to Montana, disappear into the timberline, and not speak a word to another human being for a month. Then, the anomaly appeared. Brody's peripheral vision caught the uneven spacing first. In a crowded environment, people naturally flowed like water around obstacles, maintaining an unconscious bubble of personal space. But the trio moving toward Gate D12 was a localized current of tension. There was a woman in the center, wearing standard-issue Navy nursing scrubs, pushing a specialized transport wheelchair. The man in the chair was elderly, his head lolling slightly, an ivy line snaking from his arm to a bag tucked neatly behind the seat. It was the two men flanking the nurse that made the hair on the back of Brody's neck stand at attention. They wore expensive, tailored suits, one gray, one charcoal. They walked with the predatory, synchronized glide of men who were used to dictating the physical space around them. The man in gray was entirely too close to the nurse, his shoulder practically brushing hers, his hand resting casually, yet possessively, on the small of her back. The second man in charcoal trailed half a step behind, his eyes flicking methodically over the crowd, assessing threats. Brody lowered his coffee cup. The transition from weary traveler to active operator happened in a microsecond, a cold, familiar clarity flooding his veins. He looked at the nurse. Her name badge read Brianna. She was beautiful, though the stark, fluorescent airport lighting did her no favors, highlighting the bruised, purple exhaustion beneath her wide, hazel eyes. Her complexion was ashen, her lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line, but it was her posture that screamed at Brody's instincts. Her shoulders were rigid, drawn up toward her ears. Her knuckles were bone-white where they gripped the handles of the wheelchair. She wasn't just tired. She was radiating a suppressed, suffocating terror. As they approached the gate counter, the man in the gray suit leaned in, murmuring something into her ear. Brianna flinched. It was a microscopic movement, barely a shudder, but to Brody, it was as loud as a gunshot. Domestic dispute? Brody thought, his analytical mind sorting through probabilities. No. Too organized. The trailing guy has a distinct bulge under his left armpit, shoulder holster. Government? Private security? He watched as Brianna handed over their documents to the gate agent. She turned her head, just slightly, her gaze sweeping over the crowd as if searching for a lifeline in an ocean of indifference. Her eyes met his. Brody didn't look away. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He simply held her gaze, projecting an anchor of absolute, immovable stillness in the chaotic room. Brianna's breath hitched. She saw the way he stood, the intense, laser-focused calculation in his eyes. He wasn't looking through her like the hundreds of other travelers. He was looking at the threat. The man in gray shifted his weight, momentarily distracted by the gate agent, asking a question about the medical transport paperwork. In that fractured second of opportunity, Brianna dropped her left hand from the wheelchair handle. She let it hang loose against her thigh, directly in Brody's line of sight. Deliberately, clearly, she tucked her thumb into the center of her palm. Then, she clamped her forefingers down over it, trapping the thumb in a tight fist. The universal signal for violence at home. The signal for I am trapped and need help. Brody's heart rate dropped into a slow, rhythmic thud. The weariness of his deployment vanished, replaced by the lethal, ice-cold focus that had kept him alive through 4 tours. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. I see you. Brianna's eyes widened, a flash of desperate, disbelieving hope shining in the hazel depths before she quickly turned back to the counter, her hand returning to the wheelchair. Brody didn't make a scene. He didn't reach for the weapon he didn't currently have, nor did he yell for security. The men guarding her were professionals. A sudden commotion might result in Brianna taking a bullet before TSA even unholstered their radios. He tossed his half-full coffee cup into a nearby trash can. It was time to go to work. Brody moved. He didn't march directly toward them. That would trigger the trailing man's radar immediately. Instead, he slipped into the slipstream of a large, chaotic family rushing for a nearby gate, using their bulk to mask his approach. He needed proximity. He needed to hear their voices, smell their cologne, assess the exact nature of the cage Brianna was trapped inside. He drifted toward a magazine rack situated 20 feet from gate D12, picking up a copy of a business journal he had no intention of reading. Over the glossy rim of the pages, he watched them. The gate agent, a cheerful woman, oblivious to the lethal tension across her counter, handed the boarding passes back. You're all set, Mr. Vance. We'll pre-board you and your medical staff in about 10 minutes. You can wait right over there in the priority seating. Thank you, the man in the gray suit said. His voice was smooth, cultured, but lacking any underlying warmth. Come along, Brianna. Let's get the chairman settled. Brianna pushed the wheelchair toward the designated seating area. Brody tracked her every movement. Her gait was stiff. The older man in the chair, the chairman, hadn't moved a muscle. His chest rose and fell in a shallow, artificially rhythmic way. Sedated, Brody concluded. Heavily. This isn't a medical transport. This is an extraction. Brody knew he couldn't just shadow them from a distance. He needed to create an intersection, a moment of friction to test the handler's reflexes and, more importantly, to give Brianna a thread of hope to hold on to. He timed his movement perfectly. As the man in the charcoal suit, the trailing guard, turned his head to scan the concourse behind them, Brody stepped out from the magazine rack, his duffel bag swung casually over his shoulder. He adjusted his trajectory, walking with the heavy, oblivious stride of a distracted traveler checking a phone. He let his duffel bag clip the charcoal-suited man's elbow. Hard. The reaction was instantaneous and telling. A civilian would have stumbled, cursed, or turned in surprise. The man in the charcoal suit did none of those things. His center of gravity instantly dropped. His right hand twitched, floating a terrifying 3 inches toward the lapel of his jacket, where his weapon was holstered, before his conscious brain overrode his tactical training. Watch it, the man hissed, his eyes locking onto Brody with the cold, dead stare of a reptile. Brody blinked, playing the part of the startled, tired civilian to perfection. He took a half-step back, raising his free hand in a placating gesture. My bad, man. Long flight. Wasn't looking where I was going. Up close, Brody cataloged the details. The man smelled of peppermint gum and faintly of gun oil. There was a small, flesh-colored earpiece tucked deep into his right ear canal. Coordinated communication. There might be more of them. The commotion caused Brianna and the man in the gray suit to stop and turn. Brody's eyes flicked to Brianna. In the space of a heartbeat, a silent, complex language passed between them. Her breath was hitched high in her chest, terrified that Brody had just gotten himself killed. He let his expression soften for a fraction of a second, his gaze steady and reassuring. Stay calm. I'm here. The man in the gray suit narrowed his eyes at Brody, his posture stiffening. Is there a problem? No problem, Brody said, offering a lazy, apologetic smile. Just clumsy. Have a good flight. He turned and walked away, not looking back. He knew they would be watching him until he blended back into the crowd. He took exactly 20 paces, turned a corner past a duty-free shop, and instantly pressed himself flat against the wall out of their line of sight. He pulled out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen. He bypassed the standard 911 emergency dial. A localized police response would be too slow, too clumsy, and likely end in a bloodbath. He needed a surgical scalpel, not a sledgehammer. He dialed a secure number he hadn't used in 2 years. It rang twice. "This is Reynolds," a gruff voice answered. "Marcus. It's Brody. I need a favor, and I need it 90 seconds ago." There was a pause on the line. Marcus Reynolds was a senior tactical coordinator for the Federal Air Marshal Service based out of Seattle. He and Brody had spent 6 miserable months sharing a bunker in Fallujah a lifetime ago. "Brody, I thought you were in the sandbox. You sound like you're domestic." "I'm at SeaTac, Terminal 4, near Gate D12. I have a 1090, 9 inches progress, hostage situation under the guise of a medical transport. 2 hostile handlers, armed, professional, likely private military or foreign intel. 1 female medical hostage, 1 male incapacitated target in a wheelchair." The casual tone vanished from Reynolds' voice. "Are you sure, Brody? If I pull the alarm on a medical transport, the paperwork will bury me." "The nurse threw me a distress signal, Marcus. The trailing handler nearly drew on me when I bumped him. They're heavily sedating the VIP. This is a snatch and grab. What flight is leaving out of D12 in the next 10 minutes? Keyboard clacking echoed through the phone. "D12. It's a privately chartered medical flight. Flight plan filed for a clinic in Geneva, Switzerland. Patient listed as Richard Vance." Brody's jaw tightened. They're moving a high-value target out of the country, and they're forcing the nurse to make it look legitimate, so they don't get flagged by TSA. "Damn it," Reynolds cursed. "Okay, I have 2 plainclothes marshals in Terminal 4. I'm routing them to you now. Do not engage, Brody. You are unarmed and off-duty." "Marcus," Brody said, his voice dropping an octave, cold and absolute. "If they try to push her down that jet bridge before your guys get here, I am going to break their necks." Brody hung up. He took a deep breath, compartmentalizing the adrenaline, turning it into cold, usable fuel. He peered around the corner of the duty-free shop. The situation had changed. The man in the charcoal suit was speaking into his wrist, his eyes scanning the crowd with elevated urgency. He pointed toward the corridor Brody had disappeared down. "They made me," Brody realized. "They know the bump wasn't an accident. They're spooked." The man in the gray suit grabbed the handles of the wheelchair, shoving it forward aggressively. He barked an order at Brianna, grabbing her elbow and dragging her violently away from Gate D12, away from the boarding area, and toward a restricted employee-only corridor adjacent to the restrooms. They were abandoning the flight. They were going to ground, and they were taking Brianna with them into the unseen, windowless bowels of the airport. Brody dropped his duffel bag. The heavy fire door slammed shut behind Brianna, the deafening echo cutting off the ambient noise of the terminal like a guillotine. The air in the restricted access corridor was stagnant, smelling of floor wax and ozone. "Move!" the man in gray snarled, shoving her roughly between her shoulder blades. Brianna stumbled, her rubber-soled nursing shoes squeaking against the polished concrete. She caught herself against the cinder block wall, scraping her knuckles. Panic, raw and acidic, clawed at her throat. "What are we doing?" she gasped, her voice trembling. "The flight?" "The flight is burned," the man snapped, abandoning his smooth facade. He pulled a suppressed, compact pistol from beneath his jacket, keeping it pointed toward the floor but clearly visible. That guy who bumped into Elias wasn't a tourist. He was military. Or Fed. I saw his eyes. He clocked us. Elias, the man in charcoal, pushed the wheelchair through the door behind them, securing the heavy deadbolt with a metallic clack. He drew his own weapon. "We go down to the maintenance bays. There's a service elevator that opens directly onto the tarmac. We take the emergency vehicle and breach the perimeter fence." "What about her?" Elias asked, nodding coldly at Brianna. The man in gray looked at her. There was no humanity in his eyes, just a deadly calculation of liability. "She knows too much now. She was supposed to get us through medical screening. Once we hit the tarmac, she's redundant." Tears pricked Brianna's eyes, hot and terrifying. She looked at the slumped figure of Richard Vance in the wheelchair. She had been assigned to his home care just 2 days ago. These men had shown up at his estate in the middle of the night, holding her at gunpoint, forcing her to inject him with a massive dose of sedatives and play the part of the dutiful nurse. She didn't know who Vance really was, or why they wanted him, and it was going to cost her her life. She thought of the man near the coffee kiosk, the stranger with the striking, weary eyes who had recognized her silent plea. "Where are you? Please, walk," the gray-suited man commanded, raising the barrel of the gun to aim directly at her chest. On the other side of the heavy fire door, Brody evaluated the steel barrier. It was electronically locked, requiring a badge swipe. He could hear the muffled voices through the heavy metal, the distinct, hard-edged tone of a tactical withdrawal. He didn't have time to wait for Reynolds's air marshals. If those men got Brianna into the subterranean maintenance tunnels, they would vanish, and she would be dead before her body hit the floor. Brody stepped back, scanning the area. A janitorial cart sat abandoned near the men's restroom. He grabbed a heavy, industrial-grade fire extinguisher clipped to the wall. He hefted it, testing the weight. He stepped up to the card reader beside the door. It was a magnetic strip reader. Brody didn't try to hack it. He didn't try to bypass the wiring. He swung the bottom of the heavy steel extinguisher into the plastic casing of the card reader with shattering force. Crack. Sparks showered as the plastic casing exploded. Brody struck it again, smashing the internal circuitry into a mangled mess. The security system registered the catastrophic failure and defaulted to its emergency safety protocol. In the event of a fire destroying the readers, the doors automatically disengaged the deadbolts to allow evacuation. A loud buzzer sounded, and the heavy door gave a subtle metallic click. Brody dropped the extinguisher, grabbed the door handle, and yanked it open. He didn't pause in the doorway that was the fatal funnel. He exploded into the corridor, moving low and fast. Elias, pushing the wheelchair, spun around at the sound of the breach. He raised his suppressed pistol, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. Brody launched himself forward, crossing the 10 feet between them in 2 massive strides. He drove his shoulder directly into Elias's chest with the force of a freight train. The air left Elias's lungs in a violent whoosh as Brody tackled him backward into the cinderblock wall. The suppressed pistol fired a wild shot, the fute sound echoing as the bullet dug into the ceiling above Brianna's head. Brianna screamed, throwing her hands over her ears and dropping to her knees. The man in gray whipped around, aiming at Brody's back. Brody, grappling with Elias, saw the movement. With a brutal pivot, he used Elias's body as a shield, just as the man in gray pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Elias in the shoulder, spraying crimson against the gray concrete. Before the man could adjust his aim, Brody delivered a devastating, flat-palmed strike to the nerve cluster in Elias's neck, dropping him instantly to the floor. Brody rolled off the falling body, using the momentum to sweep a heavy leg into the wheels of the medical transport chair. The wheelchair spun violently, crashing into the man in gray and knocking him off balance. Brody didn't give him a chance to recover. He closed the distance, grabbing the wrist that held the gun and twisting it upward with agonizing force. The man grunted, trying to bring his left fist around, but Brody deflected it effortlessly, driving a knee viciously into the man's ribs. Bone cracked audibly. With a final, brutal twist, Brody disarmed the man and slammed the heel of his palm upward under the man's chin, snapping his head back. The handler's eyes rolled up, and he collapsed onto the floor, motionless. The corridor was suddenly filled with an echoing, deafening silence, broken only by Brianna's ragged, terrified breathing. Brody stood over the 2 unconscious men, his chest heaving slightly. The adrenaline was a cold fire in his veins. He looked down at the suppressed pistol in his hand, expertly clearing the chamber and dropping the magazine before tossing the useless weapon aside. He turned his attention to Brianna. She was still on her knees, her hands pressed against her mouth, staring at him with a mixture of absolute shock and overwhelming relief. Brody's hard, lethal demeanor melted away instantly. He dropped to one knee in front of her, keeping a respectful distance so as not to crowd her, his hands open and empty. "Brianna," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, a deep, resonant rumble that anchored her spinning mind. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head rapidly, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her makeup. "No. You saw me. You actually saw me." "I saw you," Brody confirmed gently. He slowly reached out, wrapping a warm, calloused hand around her trembling fingers, giving them a firm, grounding squeeze. "You're safe now. I've got you." Before she could respond, a blaring, rhythmic klaxon suddenly erupted overhead. Red strobe lights recessed in the ceiling began to flash violently, painting the corridor in sharp, bloody angles. Attention all personnel. Security Protocol Omega has been initiated. This terminal is now on full lockdown. Remain where you are. Secure all doors. Brody looked up at the flashing lights, his jaw tightening. He looked back at the unconscious men, then down the long, dark corridor that led deeper into the airport's underbelly. Marcus didn't just send the marshals, Brody muttered to himself. He pulled the ripcord on the whole terminal. He looked back at Brianna, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the new variables. If these men were willing to execute a kidnapping in a major international airport, they didn't work alone. A lockdown meant no one was leaving, but it also meant that any other team members they had embedded in the airport were now trapped inside with them. Can he walk? Brody asked, pointing to the sedated chairman in the toppled wheelchair. Brianna shook her head frantically. No. They gave him enough midazolam to drop a horse. He'll be out for hours. Brody stood up, his mind already 3 steps ahead. Okay, we can't stay here. The local cops will be sweeping the halls, and if these guys have backup, they'll be sweeping too. I need to get you somewhere defensible. Who are you? Brianna breathed, staring at the man who had just dismantled 2 armed killers with his bare hands in under 10 seconds. Brody looked down at her, the flashing red lights reflecting in his dark eyes. My name is Brody, he said simply. He offered her his hand, and we need to move, right now. Brody didn't wait for Brianna's shock to fully subside. He reached down, grasping the heavy frame of the overturned medical transport chair, and righted it with a single, fluid heave. Richard Vance, the chairman, slumped sideways, completely unresponsive to the violence that had just unfolded around him. Adjust him, Brody instructed, keeping his eyes on the far end of the corridor. Make sure his airway is clear. Brianna blinked, shaking off the paralysis of the last 5 minutes. Her nursing instincts, honed through grueling shifts in overcrowded ICUs, kicked in. She stepped forward, her hands steadying as they found their professional rhythm. She adjusted Vance's head, checking his carotid pulse, and inspecting the IV line that had tangled around his wrist. He's stable, but his blood pressure is dropping, Brianna said, her voice tight but remarkably composed. The midazolam drip was set too high. Can you dial it back without waking him up? Brody asked, stripping the radios and spare magazines off the unconscious handlers. Yes, but he's dead weight. We can't run with him. Then we don't run, we ghost. Brody pointed toward a heavy metal door labeled Utility Corridor B. Authorized personnel only. That way, they moved. Brianna pushed the chair, the rubber wheels squeaking ominously against the polished concrete, while Brody walked point, sweeping the angles of every intersection. They left the brightly lit employee corridor and descended into the subterranean architecture of SeaTac. Here, the gleaming aesthetics of the passenger terminal vanished. It was an industrial wasteland of thick PVC pipes, massive HVAC ducts groaning under the pressure of conditioned air, and rows of flickering, cage-protected fluorescent tubes. The air smelled of aviation fuel, stagnant water, and the dry, metallic tang of electricity. The blaring klaxons from the terminal above were muffled down here, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in Brianna's teeth. Suddenly, her knees buckled. The adrenaline that had kept her upright finally burned out, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. She stumbled forward, catching herself heavily on the handles of the wheelchair. A suppressed sob tore its way out of her throat. Brody was beside her in an instant. He didn't tell her to quiet down or to toughen up. He simply placed a heavy, warm hand squarely between her shoulder blades. Hey, he said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing cadence. Look at me. Brianna forced her eyes up. In the dim, flickering light, Brody's face was a study in controlled calm. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a deep, empathetic understanding that anchored her spiraling panic. You're experiencing an adrenaline crash, he explained quietly. It feels like you're dying. You're not. Your brain is just trying to process the fact that you survived. Breathe with me. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. He exaggerated his own breathing, expanding his chest, giving her a visual metronome to follow. Brianna squeezed her eyes shut, forcing her lungs to mimic his rhythm. In, 2, 3, 4, hold, out, 2, 3, 4. After a minute, the violent trembling in her hands subsided to a manageable tremor. She opened her eyes, deeply embarrassed but profoundly grateful. I'm sorry, she whispered. Never apologize for a physiological response, Brody replied, his hand lingering on her back for one more reassuring second before he stepped away. You did everything right up there, Brianna. You signaled for help. You didn't panic when the shooting started. You're doing great. A sharp crackle of static echoed from the stolen radio clipped to Brody's belt, slicing through the quiet moment. Viper 1, this is Control. What is your status? Over. The voice was heavily accented, crisp, and professional. Brody unclipped the radio, turning the volume down until it was a mere whisper against his ear. He didn't respond. Viper 1, respond. We have lockdown protocols active terminal-wide. Did you secure the package? Brody looked at Brianna, his expression hardening back into the lethal mask she had seen at the gate. They have a control element, someone overseeing the operation from inside the airport. What does that mean for us? She asked, a fresh wave of dread washing over her. It means the guys I dropped weren't the only ones on the payroll, Brody said grimly. And Control just figured out that Viper 1 is offline. They're going to send a secondary team to find out why. He looked down the long, shadows-drenched corridor. We need a hole to hide in, now. They found an abandoned electrical junction room locked behind a heavy, steel-grated door. Brody bypassed the magnetic lock using a small multi-tool he carried in his pocket, ushering Brianna and the wheelchair inside before pulling the door shut. The room was cramped, dominated by massive, humming electrical panels that generated a stifling heat. But it had no windows, one entrance, and thick concrete walls. It was a fortress. Sit, Brody commanded softly, pointing to an overturned plastic crate in the corner. Brianna collapsed onto it, her legs finally refusing to hold her weight. Brody moved to the door, pressing his ear against the cold steel, listening to the vast, empty echo of the tunnels outside. Satisfied that they weren't being immediately pursued, he turned his attention to the man in the wheelchair. Richard Vance. Who is he? Brody asked, retrieving a small penlight from his jacket and shining it into Vance's unresponsive eyes, checking his pupillary response. I don't know, Brianna admitted, rubbing her temples. The agency just told me he was a high-net-worth individual requiring palliative transport to a facility in Europe. They offered me triple my usual rate for a weekend assignment. She let out a bitter, hollow laugh. I needed the money. My younger sister is in a residential rehab program. The insurance stopped paying last month. Brody paused, looking at her. The fragmented piece of her backstory clicked into place. She wasn't greedy. She was desperate. It was a vulnerability these men had exploited perfectly. They targeted you because you had a pressure point, Brody said softly. It makes you easy to manipulate. It makes me stupid, she countered, wiping a tear from her cheek angrily. No. It makes you human. Brody turned back to Vance. A private military contractor doesn't stage a high-risk extraction in a major U.S. airport for a random billionaire. He has something they want, and it's not just money. Brody began a rapid, methodical search of Vance's person. He checked the lining of the old man's expensive tweed jacket, the soles of his shoes, and the hidden seams of his trousers. Nothing. What are you looking for? Brianna asked, watching his hands move with practiced efficiency. Data. A physical key, something small enough to smuggle, but too sensitive to transmit digitally. He crouched down, examining the specialized wheelchair. It was a top-of-the-line medical model, designed for long-term comfort. Brody ran his hands along the tubular aluminum frame. When he reached the right armrest, his fingers paused. He tapped the metal tube with his knuckle. It didn't ring hollow like the left side. It produced a dull, dense thud. Brody pulled out his knife, a wicked, matte black folding blade, and pried off the rubber end cap of the armrest. Inside, nestled in a bed of shock-absorbent foam, was a sleek, titanium cylinder no larger than a cigar tube. He pulled it out, holding it up to the dim light of the junction room. It was a military-grade biometric hard drive. Bingo, Brody murmured. Brianna stared at it. What is that? Whatever it is, it's the reason you were almost killed today. Suddenly, the stolen radio on Brody's belt cracked to life again, but this time, there was no voice. It was a rhythmic, pulsing tone. Beep, beep, beep. Brody's blood ran cold. He looked at the titanium cylinder in his hand, then at the wheelchair. He flipped the chair forward, inspecting the underside of the seat cushion. Nestled near the battery pack was a small, flashing red LED light. A transponder, Brody said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. They aren't just calling their guys on the radio, they're tracking the chair. Beep, 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 The pulsing grew slightly faster, slightly louder. "They're close," Brody said, his eyes snapping to the steel door. "And they know exactly where we are." Brody didn't hesitate. He grabbed the transponder, ripping it from its wiring with a sharp tug. He tossed it to the concrete floor and crushed it beneath the heel of his heavy boot. The flashing red light died, and the rhythmic beeping on the radio ceased. "Too late," Brody muttered. "They already have our last known vector. They'll sweep this sector." He turned to Brianna. The panic had returned to her eyes, wide and terrified in the dim light of the junction room. "Brianna, listen to me," Brody said, gripping her shoulders. "I have to leave this room." "No," she gasped, her hands instinctively grabbing the fabric of his jacket. "You can't leave us here. They'll kill us." "They will kill you if they corner us in this room," he corrected, his voice a steady, unyielding rock in her storm. "They have thermal optics. If they breach that door, we're fish in a barrel. I have to go out there and intercept them before they reach this corridor." He looked around the room, his eyes landing on a narrow, grated ventilation shaft near the ceiling, partially obscured by the massive electrical panels. "Help me get him up," Brody ordered. Working together, fighting against the dead weight of the sedated billionaire, they managed to drag Vance into the narrow space behind the largest electrical panel. It was a suffocatingly tight fit, hiding them entirely from the doorway. Brody crouched down, leveling his gaze with Brianna's. "Do not make a sound. If you hear shooting, cover your ears and keep your head down. Do not come out until I say your name. Understand?" She swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry, and nodded. "Please come back." "I always come back," he said. It was a promise forged in darker places than this. Brody slipped out of the junction room, pulling the heavy steel door silently shut behind him. He was back in the subterranean tunnels. He closed his eyes for a 3-second count, letting his pupils dilate, adjusting to the oppressive gloom. He moved silently, a ghost in the machine of the airport. He found a junction where 3 corridors intersected a natural choke point. Above him, a thick network of steam pipes ran parallel to the ceiling. He climbed a maintenance ladder, perching himself on a thick steel crossbeam in the shadows, directly above the intersection. He drew the heavy, suppressed pistol he had taken from Elias. It wasn't his preferred weapon, but it would have to do. He waited. The silence was absolute, heavy and expectant. 2 minutes later, they appeared. There were 3 of them. They didn't move like the suited handlers above. They moved like a military fire team. They wore dark tactical gear, suppressed submachine guns tight to their shoulders, and heavy, multi-lensed night vision goggles strapped to their helmets. They were communicating via hand signals, sweeping the corridor with lethal precision. The lead operative paused exactly where Brody had crushed the transponder, kneeling to inspect the shattered plastic on the floor. He signaled to the others, pointing directly down the corridor toward the electrical room where Brianna was hiding. Brody couldn't let them take another step. From his perch, Brody aimed at a high-pressure valve on the main steam pipe directly above the operatives. He squeezed the trigger twice. Foot. The bullets shattered the brass valve. Instantly, a deafening, high-pitched scream of escaping pressure filled the corridor. A massive cloud of superheated, opaque white steam violently erupted downward, instantly blinding the thermal optics of the operatives below. Chaos erupted. Brody dropped from the crossbeam, plunging directly into the blinding white fog. He didn't need to see. He knew exactly where they had been standing. He landed behind the trailing operative, grabbing the man's helmet and violently twisting, using the heavy night vision goggles as a lever. The man crumpled silently. The steam was scalding, burning the exposed skin of Brody's neck, but he pushed through the pain. The middle operative spun wildly, firing a blind burst from his submachine gun into the fog. The bullets sparked harmlessly against the concrete walls. Brody lunged low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him, following up with a brutal strike from the butt of his stolen pistol to the operative's temple. 2 down. The lead operative, the one who had inspected the tracker, was seasoned. He had dropped to a prone position the moment the steam erupted, making himself a smaller target. As the fog began to thin slightly, he spotted Brody's silhouette. He raised his weapon. Brody dove sideways just as a suppressed 3-round burst tore through the air where his chest had been a millisecond before. He hit the concrete hard, rolling to his feet, but he felt a sharp, searing line of heat across his left bicep. A graze. He didn't have a clear shot. Brody threw his empty pistol directly at the man's face. The operative flinched, instinctively raising a hand to block the heavy metal object. It was the only opening Brody needed. He closed the distance, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and slamming him into the brickwork. They wrestled for control of the submachine gun in the thinning steam. The operative was strong, fueled by adrenaline, but Brody was fueled by something colder. With a savage wrench, Brody tore the weapon free, stepping back and delivering a punishing kick to the man's knee, snapping it backward. The operative went down with a muffled cry. Brody stood over him, chest heaving, the steam swirling around his legs like phantoms. His left arm throbbed, warm blood soaking into the dark fabric of his Henley. He knelt quickly, stripping the man of his spare magazines and radio. As he picked up the comms unit, he heard a voice cold, echoing, and terrifyingly calm. Viper 2? Sitrep? Have you located the package? Before Brody could crush the radio, the operative on the floor, coughing blood, smiled a bloody, defiant grin, and keyed a hidden mic on his wrist. Sector 4. Utility tunnels. Target is... Brody brought the heavy butt of the submachine gun down, silencing the man instantly. But the damage was done. The transmission had gone out. Brody looked down the corridor toward the heavy steel door of the electrical room. His cover was blown. The entire force would be converging on this exact location. He wiped a smear of blood from his jaw, the hunter now becoming the hunted. He had to get Brianna and the chairman out of Sector 4 before the net closed entirely. The heavy steel door of the electrical junction room clicked open with agonizing slowness. Brianna, huddled in the stifling, dust-choked space behind the humming panels, squeezed her eyes shut. She clutched a heavy, rusted wrench she had found on the floor, her knuckles white, her heart battering against her ribs. Brianna? The voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It was him. She exhaled a fractured sob and crawled out from her hiding spot. The sight of him stole the remaining breath from her lungs. Brody stood in the doorway, the harsh fluorescent light slicing across his face. He looked like a man forged in a crucible. His scuffed leather jacket was gone, abandoned somewhere in the tunnels. The dark fabric of his Henley was torn at the left shoulder, the fabric plastered to his skin with fresh, dark blood that dripped steadily down his forearm. "You're hurt," she gasped, the wrench clattering to the floor. The paralyzing fear in her chest instantly alchemized into something else, her professional training. The nurse took over. "Graze," Brody grunted, leaning heavily against the doorframe, though he stubbornly kept his stolen submachine gun leveled at the corridor behind him. "It's fine. We have to move." "It's not fine. You're bleeding out," Brianna snapped, the authority returning to her voice. She didn't wait for his permission. She practically threw herself toward the medical transport wheelchair, ripping open the canvas supply bag strapped to the back. Brody watched her, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his rigid features. The trembling, terrified woman from the airport terminal was gone, replaced by a hyper-focused medical professional. She moved with an economy of motion, tearing open a field dressing, grabbing sterile gauze and a roll of heavy medical tape. "Sit on the crate," she ordered, pointing to the plastic box. Brody didn't argue. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, and the burning agony in his bicep was screaming for attention. He sat heavily, his eyes never leaving the doorway. Brianna knelt beside him. Up close, he smelled of ozone, sweat, and gunpowder. Carefully, she pushed the torn fabric of his shirt aside. The bullet had taken a deep, jagged groove out of the outer muscle of his bicep. It wasn't arterial, but it was messy, and the heat of the steam pipes had agitated the bleeding. "This is going to burn," she warned, ripping open a large antiseptic wipe. "Do it," he said, his jaw clenching. She pressed the pad firmly into the wound. Brody inhaled sharply through his nose, the muscles in his neck cording like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. Brianna worked quickly, her hands steady, packing the wound with gauze before binding it tightly with the tape. It was an intimate, violent moment of triage. Her fingers brushed against the hard, scarred canvas of his skin, feeling the steady, slow thud of his pulse. He was impossibly calm. "There," she said, cutting the tape with a small pair of trauma shears. "It will hold, but you need stitches. And antibiotics." "Add it to the list," Brody said, looking down at the neat, professional bandage. He looked back up at her, his dark eyes softening a fraction. "Thank you." Brianna swallowed hard, nodding. "You promised you'd come back." "I did." Brody stood up, testing the mobility of his arm. It was stiff, but the bleeding was contained. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy plastic keycard attached to a retractable lanyard. He held it up for her to see. I took this off the team leader. It's an administrative master key. It'll get us through the locked bulkheads. Where are we going? She asked, helping him pull Richard Vance out from behind the electrical panel and back into the wheelchair. Up, Brody said. He pulled out the radio he had taken from the fallen operative. Control knows we're in Sector 4. They're going to pinch the tunnels, sending teams from both ends to squeeze us into the middle. Our only vertical exit is the heavy freight elevator at the end of Corridor C. It leads directly to the tarmac maintenance bays. But won't they be waiting for us there? Yes, Brody said bluntly. He didn't believe in sugarcoating tactical realities. But Marcus and his air marshals are locked out of the secure zones upstairs. The tarmac is technically an exterior perimeter. It's our only chance to link up with a friendly force. He keyed the stolen radio, dialing it to the emergency frequency he knew Reynolds would be monitoring. Marcus, Brody said quietly into the mic. Do you read? Static hissed, followed by the tense, stressed voice of the air marshal. Brody, thank God, we have a massive problem. The airport's central security grid has been hijacked. Every reinforced door in Terminal 4 is locked down tight. My guys are trapped in the concourse with 1,000 panicking civilians. We can't get to the lower levels. Brody cursed under his breath. The mastermind behind this control wasn't just well-funded. They were terrifyingly capable. They had severed the head of the airport's security apparatus. I'm in the subterranean utility tunnels, Brody reported. The hostile force is sweeping Sector 4. I have the nurse and the VIP. We're moving to the heavy freight elevator, designation C Alpha. It breaches at the South Tarmac Maintenance Bay. I know the one, Reynolds said, the sound of a heavy siren wailing in the background of his transmission. But Brody, the tarmac is locked down too. Local PD SWAT is establishing an outer perimeter, but they won't breach without knowing the hostiles' exact locations. It's a standoff. Tell SWAT to converge on the South Maintenance Bay, Brody ordered, his voice taking on the uncompromising timbre of a commander. I'll bring the package to the bay doors. But Marcus, I need a distraction. I need them looking outward when I come up from the floor. I'll get them there, Reynolds promised. Keep the girl safe, Brody. Always. Brody clipped the radio back to his belt. He looked at Brianna, who was checking Vance's IV line one last time. Are you ready for this? He asked her. Brianna took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of her wrinkled, blood-spattered scrubs. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it no longer controlled her. Brody had given her back her agency. I'm a trauma nurse, Brody, she said, her chin lifting defiantly. I don't lose patience on my watch. Brody gave her a slow, appreciative nod. Let's go. The journey through the remainder of Sector 4 was a suffocating nightmare of shadows and tension. The emergency backup lighting painted the industrial tunnels in a sickly, jaundiced yellow. Brody took point, the heavy submachine gun tucked tightly against his uninjured shoulder. Brianna followed a half-step behind, pushing the wheelchair over the uneven concrete flooring. Every dripping pipe sounded like a footstep. Every groan of the HVAC system sounded like a radio transmission. Brody moved with terrifying silence, pausing at every intersection to check the angles, his eyes sweeping the darkness for the telltale glint of thermal optics. 3 times they had to press themselves flat into recessed alcoves, holding their breath as the sweeping, methodical beams of tactical flashlights passed over the adjacent corridors. They're hurting us, Brody whispered, after they narrowly avoided a 2-man patrol. They've sealed the lateral exits. They want us to go to the elevator. Then why are we going there? Brianna whispered back, her knuckles white on the wheelchair handles. Because it's a funnel, Brody explained, checking the chamber of his weapon. And sometimes, the only way out of a funnel is to blow a hole straight through the bottom of it. They reached the end of Corridor C. The tunnel terminated in a massive, reinforced, steel alcove housing the heavy freight elevator. The doors were immense, scratched yellow metal, designed to haul industrial machinery and baggage carts to the surface. To the right of the doors was a heavy card reader. Above it, a digital display blinked ominously. System lockdown. Override required. Brody stepped up to the terminal. He pulled the stolen master keycard from his pocket and swiped it. The light on the reader flashed red. A harsh buzzer sounded. Access denied. Damn it, Brody hissed. Control killed the master keys from the central mainframe. They trapped us in the basement. Behind them, echoing down the long, dark corridor they had just traversed, came the unmistakable, rhythmic crunch of heavy combat boots. Not a patrol, a squad. They were closing the net. Brianna spun around, staring into the gloom. "Brody." "I hear them," he said, dropping to one knee beside the card reader. He pulled his multi-tool from his pocket, snapping out a flathead screwdriver. He jammed it into the seam of the card reader's casing, prying the plastic cover off with a violent twist. A rat's nest of wires spilled out. "I don't have time to slice this cleanly," Brody muttered, his fingers working desperately through the wires. He needed to find the analog relay that bypassed the digital mainframe. The sound of boots grew louder. Flashlight beams began to slice through the dust at the far end of the corridor. "Brody, they're coming," Brianna said, her voice rising in panic. She instinctively stepped in front of the wheelchair, placing herself between the encroaching threat and her unconscious patient. Brody found a thick green wire and a red wire. He stripped the casing off both with his teeth, spitting the plastic out. "Brianna, take the pistol, the one in my waistband. If they round that corner before I cross these wires, you shoot at the lights. Blind them." She hesitated for only a second before reaching down and pulling the heavy, suppressed pistol from his belt. It was incredibly heavy, the grip cold and unfamiliar in her hands. She raised it, pointing it down the tunnel, her hands shaking violently. 30 seconds. A heavily accented voice echoed from the darkness. "Sweep the terminal end. They're cornered." "Come on," Brody growled, twisting the bare copper wires together. A shower of sparks exploded from the panel, singeing Brody's knuckles. The massive freight elevator shuddered, a deep mechanical groan vibrating through the concrete floor. The red light on the reader blinked out, replaced by a solid, glorious green. The heavy yellow doors violently parted, revealing the cavernous, grease-stained interior of the lift. "Get in," Brody yelled, shoving the wires back into the wall. Brianna shoved the wheelchair forward, the wheels catching on the threshold. She heaved with all her might, pushing Vance into the back corner of the elevator. Brody spun around, raising his submachine gun as the first tactical operative rounded the corner 50 yards down the hall. The operative raised his weapon, the red dot of a laser sight painting Brody's chest. Brody didn't aim. He laid down a blinding, suppressive burst of automatic fire down the corridor. The deafening roar of the weapon in the enclosed space was apocalyptic. The operative dove for cover behind a steam pipe. Brody lunged backward into the elevator, smashing his fist against the UP button on the control panel. The heavy yellow doors began to slide shut. More operatives spilled into the corridor, their weapons rising. Bullets sparked against the narrowing gap of the elevator doors, pinging wildly off the steel frame. Brianna screamed, dropping to the floor and covering Vance with her own body. With a final, metallic clash, the doors sealed shut. The elevator jerked violently, protesting the sudden movement, and began its slow, agonizing ascent toward the tarmac. Brody dropped the empty magazine from his weapon, his hands moving entirely on muscle memory as he slammed his final magazine into the well. He looked down at Brianna, who was curled defensively over the old man. "Are you hit?" he asked, his chest heaving. She looked up, her eyes wide, and shook her head. "Good." Brody racked the charging handle of the gun. He looked up at the digital floor indicator above the doors. It was climbing slowly. Maintenance, Level 2. Maintenance, Level 1. Tarmac. "Brianna," Brody said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "When these doors open, all hell is going to break loose. Control knows exactly where this box goes. They will have a firing squad waiting on the other side." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, titanium biometric drive. He pressed it into her trembling hand, folding her fingers over it. "If I go down," he said, locking his eyes onto hers, "you throw this as far as you can, you make them chase it, and you run to the light." "Brody." "No. Promise me," he demanded softly. Tears tracked through the grime on her face. She gripped the cold titanium cylinder. "I promise." The elevator shuddered to a halt. The bell chimed a cheerful, sickeningly normal sound. The doors began to open. Searing daylight flooded the elevator as the doors parted, revealing the sprawling South Maintenance Bay. But Brody wasn't looking at the parked aircraft. In the center of the hangar idled an armored SUV. 4 men waited. 3 were heavily armed operatives with rifles trained on the elevator. The 4th, a silver-haired man in a pristine Navy suit, stood slightly ahead. This was Control. "Commander," the suited man called out. "My name is Sterling. Step out of the box." Brody kept his body angled, shielding Brianna and the wheelchair. "Flights cancelled, Sterling." You are outgunned and out of time, Sterling replied smoothly. Leave the nurse and the old man. Hand over the drive, and you walk away. Brody's mind raced. SWAT was delayed. He had to stall. He reached into his pocket and produced a metallic cylinder, his waterproof match case, not the drive, holding it directly over a heavy iron drainage grate. Lower your weapons, or you'll be swimming in Seattle sludge for a month trying to find this. Sterling hesitated, raising a hand to stall his men. Behind Brody, Brianna saw an operative shifting for a clear shot. She didn't wait. Grabbing the wheelchair, she violently shoved Vance out of the line of fire, then lunged left, slamming her shoulder into a cart of pressurized oxygen tanks. The heavy steel cylinders crashed to the concrete. One sheared its brass valve, erupting into an unguided missile that rocketed across the hangar and smashed into the SUV. "Take him!" Sterling screamed. Brody dropped the fake cylinder, firing a controlled burst that dropped the flanking operative. He dove back into the elevator, tackling Brianna as suppressive fire chewed into the steel doors. They were pinned. Suddenly, the exterior hangar doors exploded inward. A massive armored Bearcat smashed through, sirens screaming. A dozen heavily armored SWAT officers poured out, led by Marcus Reynolds. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." The remaining operatives surrendered instantly. Sterling, however, bolted for a rear exit. Brody vaulted from the elevator. He didn't fire. He hit Sterling at a full sprint, driving him to the concrete and pinning him with a heavy knee to the chest. He aimed his pistol between Sterling's eyes before Reynolds shouted him down. The echo of gunfire faded. Brody stood up, stepping back as SWAT secured the mastermind. Across the hangar, Brianna slowly stood. Paramedics rushed past to attend to Vance. Brody walked toward her, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. She reached out, placing her hand flat against his chest, right over his beating heart. "You threw the signal," Brody said softly. Brianna managed a small, exhausted smile. "And you answered it." 2 hours later, Brianna sat on the bumper of an ambulance outside Terminal 4, a thick shock blanket draped over her shoulders. The airport was a sea of flashing lights. Richard Vance was secure, the biometric drive safely in federal custody. She looked up as Brody emerged from a command tent. He was cleaned up, his arm professionally bandaged. He didn't approach the ambulance. Instead, he stopped at the edge of the shadows, locking eyes with her one last time. He gave her a single, respectful nod, an acknowledgement of a bond forged in fire before turning and disappearing into the Seattle night, a ghost returning to the wild. Sometimes, the loudest cries for help are entirely silent, and the greatest acts of courage come from ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances. If you felt the tension and loved the suspense of Brody and Brianna's story, please like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic, pulse-pounding thrillers.